Hey fellow Tarnished! We're back with the build series. The focus of this series is to have builds that are aesthetically unique and have distinct playstyles that fulfill a certain role-playing fantasy, with many options to use in combat. So ugly white mask builds are not allowed here. This doesn't mean that our builds are completely unoptimized, because they're all still very powerful. It's just not the main focus. Stick around for the last build because it is my favorite. And without further ado, let's get to it. Here's my Spartan Captain build.
This build is all about using a shield and a spear to stance break enemies very easily and deal massive counter-attack damage, just like the real Spartans did to their enemies in 400 BC. Our shield of choice is the Smith's Crypt shield, and this little thing is absolutely busted. It has massive range, does good damage, scales well with strength, and has no damage drop off. And it costs 3 FP, which is nothing. Who the hell designed this thing? You can spam this as much as you want and no one can stop you. Compare this to the weapon I originally wanted to use for this build, the Smith's Crypt Spear, a throwable weapon that is slower, does less damage, costs huge amounts of stamina, and has huge damage drop-off. Why? Why did this have to suck so bad? Like, I don't know, really. The Smith's Crypt Shield is very good at picking off smaller enemies and such. You don't even need to use any talismans like the Sword of Alexander or the Smithing Talismans, just put on the thing and it works just fine. It's even better as a ranged option than most bows. A common bow, L. For bosses, we're using it to apply constant pressure when we can't hit them at a melee range, because this is a stance breaking build, and most bosses have moves that make them dodge away, or do massive AoE attacks where you can't do much while they recover their stance damage. But then you just throw your shield at them a few times, and you're good to go. The only problem with it is that it is a small shield, meaning that it is terrible for blocking, because you do get shit stability, and tons of chip damage. But then that's why we use the Deflecting Heart here. And the Deflecting Heart here has just become this crutch that makes every cool build that might not have worked previously just be viable. You know what it does. If you time your blocks with any weapon or shield, then you get much less stamina damage, no physical damage, and much less elemental damage. But that's just up there, because if you block multiple attacks perfectly, you get much more damage and stance damage with your guard counters. And the numbers are just insane. So yeah, your cool new shield doesn't have 100% physical damage negation? Use the Deflecting Heart here. Your build doesn't deal good enough damage? Use the Deflecting Heart here. And it will propel your damage output into the stratosphere. And it just makes every build that doesn't even need it more fun to use. Such a goated item. Our other physic tier is the Stone Barb Crack tier, which makes us do more stance damage. But it only lasts 30 seconds, so be careful when using it. Our spear of choice is the Partisan with the heavy affinity. Spears are really cool for guard counter builds. You get good range, and so you can actually guard counter against some of the more long range attacks and still hit. There is no particular reason I'm using this spear specifically, it's just my favorite spear in terms of looks. Feel free to experiment with other spears if you like. I do occasionally swap to the Messmer Shoulder Grade Spear, which is much slower, but it gives us much more damage and stance damage. The S4 that you use is not very important, since you would need to swap out the shield to use it, and that is a bit of a hassle. But I use Royal Knight's Resolve for more damage on the next hit, and this can actually result in some insane damage. For talismans, we of course have the Curved Sword Talisman for boosted guard counters, the Blade of Mercy, which gives us a 20% damage buff when we riposte an enemy, the Spear Talisman for more counter damage, and the Dagger Talisman for better riposte damage. And finally, we have the look. I was inspired by this post on Reddit, I saw it and I thought, we're using the altered version of the Freya armor, the Freya greaves, the Bolgot helm, and the Crucible gauntlets. Making a Spartan looking build is something that I always wanted to do in Souls games, and I'm very happy that we can make one that looks this authentic in Elden Ring. Next up is my High Priestess build. The idea for this build is that we are a lot like pure sorcery builds, but we're actually a faith build, so we deal good damage from range, we have access to a multitude of buffs and utility spells and different damage types. Being a more support type of build, I think this is more fun to play with summons or in a co-op setting. This doesn't however mean that this build is not powerful when playing solo. Far from it actually, it's pretty solid there too. Our staff of choice is the Barbed Staff Spear. Like the name implies, this is actually a spear, or rather a great spear actually. Great spears are slow poke weapons that deal some very respectable damage and stance damage, and this one is a very solid option. We get good faith scaling and holy damage from it, we also get passive bleed, we only get 55 of it, but that's usually enough to proc bleed at least once in a boss fight, which is a great bonus. Of course we're mostly using this for its weapon art, which is this barrage of holy projectiles that deal good damage from a distance. You can hold this for a really long time, but you can also roll out of it whenever you want, which makes it very versatile. This attack actually has a bug where it actually does deal some bleed buildup. I doubt this will ever be patched, so feel free to take advantage of that. For what spells to use, we of course use the Golden Vow for more damage and defense. We can also use the Howl of Shabriri, which will buff all our damage by 25%, but it also makes you take 30% more damage. However, I don't think this matters too much, because we already attack from a distance, so we're a bit harder to hit. But if you don't want to, then you can use the Light S4 from the Sword of Light and get a 20% damage buff to your holy damage. I also like to use the Blessing of the Erdtree, which gives you tons of passive healing and stacks with our other buffs. For offensive spells, use things like the Giant Golden Arc, which has quickly become one of my favorite spells in the game. It looks gorgeous, has really good tracking, long range, a huge horizontal hitbox, and can even go through enemies. Golden Arcs is your exploration focused spell. It's much more FP efficient. Spire is one of my favorite new spells. It's one of the only spells where you can continuously cast the spell for as long as you have FP to cast it. Sadly, the damage is just not there, and it's just too slow in general. Don't use this, but keep an eye out for if they buff this one day. Heal from Afar is the best healing spell in the game. Use it to heal yourself and any allies that you have. It's much more efficient than using actual heal flasks. Another spell that I like to use is the multi-layered Rings of Light, which has long range, has some good lingering damage, and is cool to have while you're casting your next spell. Our seal of choice is the Spiral Tree seal, which is the worst seal in the game, but it does boost our Golden Arcs and Giant Golden Arc by 20%. And those are our bread and butter. So yeah, we're using it anyway. I occasionally like to switch to the Perfumer Sacred Shield, and on it I use the S4 Holy Ground, which creates this little area on the ground, where if you stand in it, you get boosted defense and some passive healing, and it does stack with Blessing of the Erdtree and other buffs. I also like to use the item Horned Burn, which summons these homing projectiles that follow you around. This deals holy damage, so it is boosted by other items that we use. The damage isn't great on its own, but this doesn't really matter since you will just cast it before a fight and it will help you a little bit. It also attacks any annoying enemies that try to ambush you. This is very situational, but it is far from useless since we do have many ranged attacks. For physic tiers, I use the Holy Shroud and Crack tier for more holy damage, the Deflecting Heart tier, which completely covers for this build's weakness of not being the best melee fighter. For talismans, I use the Shard of Alexander for more weapon art damage, the Godfrey Icon, which boosts charged spells, and all of our offensive spells are chargeable, so this is good for us. I also use the Flux Canvas Talisman, which boosts incantation damage by 8%. If you're able to stay at full health for long periods of time, then replace this with the Ritual Soul Talisman, which boosts all your damage by 10%. Finally, there is the Sacred Scorpion Charm, which boosts our holy damage by 12%, but it does result in us taking 10% more damage, so be careful while using it. This is the look I went for, with the Marais robe, the High Priest hat, the Nox bracelets, and the beige trousers. This is a very unique build overall. It's very niche and it doesn't exactly scream Elden Lord, but I'm sure someone out there would really like this, and I made this for you. Next, there is my Blacksmith God build. I debated a lot on whether this build belongs in the series, simply because it's far too powerful. But then I thought, let's make that the theme, and include it anyway. The Blacksmith God build destroys everything in its way, and you don't even need to try while using it. And we don't even need to look cringy while doing it. If you want to still be challenged while using it, then just go to higher NG plus cycles. The way I like to play this build is to cast Flame of the Fell God, go up to an enemy, deflect one attack or two, and then guard counter for huge amounts of damage. Our weapon of choice is the Anvil Hammer, which is a colossal weapon. This is one of my favorite looking weapons in the game. This thing has the best unbuffed AR of any weapon in the entire game, and it shows. Add to that the fact that the colossal weapons get the most stance damage and guard boost in the entire game, and then add the Deflecting Heart tier on top of that and you have a build that is just insane. The Anvil Hammer has this weapon art where you slam the weapon into the ground and set up spears that do damage in an AoE. This deals decent damage, but is so overshadowed by the rest of your moveset that I just never use it. The Anvil Hammer is not technically a Smith's Crypt weapon, but it does require 11 intelligence like the rest of them. So technically, you can use these weapons if you are bored and want to deal shit damage from range for some reason or another. Our seal of choice is the Giant Seal, which is by far one of the worst seals to have at our level, but it does boost all our spells significantly, and I don't use any other spells, so I use this anyway. The spells we use are the Giant Flame spells. Flame of the Fell God slowly tracks our enemies before detonating, dealing massive damage and knocking small enemies and Malenia off the ground. Giant's Flame Take V has some of the highest damage in the game for a high range spell. It can also knock some small enemies off the ground. Flame Fall Upon Them is a long range AoE option that just melts bigger enemies. Burn of Flame sends these pillars of fire around you, dealing massive damage, especially to bigger enemies that can get hit by multiple pillars of fire. It also bots you in this ducking animation where you can avoid some attacks that way. O Flame is a good melee range option, but Catch Flame is better, so use that instead. And finally, Surge of Flame and Well of Flame are completely lame, and you should never touch them. For talismans, I use the Two-Handed Sword Talisman, which gives us more damage when we two-hand our weapon, which we will be doing the majority of the time. The Curved Sword Talisman for more guard counter damage. The Axe Talisman for more heavy attack damage. And the Blade of Mercy, because we might as well get a damage buff after we inevitably reboost our enemies. This is the look I went for, using the Iron Rivet armor, the Circlet of Light, the Banded Boots, and the Godric Shoulder gauntlets. Definitely one of the most badass characters I've ever made.
You've heard of spell blades. But have you heard of spell shields? Because this is exactly what we're doing today. Here's my spell shield build. As you might guess, this build is all about being a battle mage. But our main weapon is a shield, and we're also using Malenia's Great Rune to heal damage that is dealt to us. Our shield of choice is the Carian Thrusting Shield. Thrusting shields are shields that also double as melee weapons, presenting a beautiful balance between offense and defense. The way it works is that you get blocking frames at the end of every light attack, and you can extend the blocking frames by waiting a little before inputting your next light attack. And so, you can basically time the block window between your light attacks to an enemy attack, and then input the next light attack in the combo. This will save you from a few attacks by default, but it also has a very high skill ceiling. Heavy attacks also get block frames, but they get them during the charge up window. Running attacks, jumping attacks, and even guard counters don't miss out on this feature either. I'm sure you can see the potential here. It basically means that if you're playing correctly, you never have to stop attacking. And there are two ways the devs try to balance this. First is obvious, which is stamina consumption. You need to play smart or the enemies will break your guard. The other way is chip damage. Neither of the thrusting shields have 100% physical damage negation, which means that every attack will deal a little bit of damage to us if we block it. And shields in general get chip damage with all elemental attacks. And the way I thought I'd deal with this at first was to combine two items. First is the deflecting heart tier, which would make it so that timing our blocks would negate all physical damage and most elemental damage. And the second item was immutable shield, which was a spell that would make it so that you take no chip damage from elemental attacks. But this playstyle had two problems. First is the fact that the deflecting heart tier only worked on dedicated blocks, and by that I mean blocks that you do with the block button. And that made it so that you are discouraged from using the unique properties of this weapon. And the second problem was the fact that immutable shield had a very long casting animation, and would only last 30 seconds. Which is just miserable, man, like, why is this so bad? And so my solution to this was to discard immutable shield and replace it with a scholar's shield, which does add physical and magic damage negation, while also making it so that we take less stamina damage. And then we add our third item that we mentioned, which is Malenia's Great Rune. Malenia's Great Rune gives us time to recover lost health by attacking an enemy. Players are usually discouraged from using it, because the window to recover health only lasts 1.5 seconds. Going for the heal in that time can easily go wrong for you. There's a good chance that you will get hit, and even if you do manage to get a couple of hits in, you might not heal as much health as you'd like. But this is exactly why the rune is actually perfect for us. And that's because we'll be mostly healing chip damage. And most chip damage will be healed by like one hit or two. And so we can take full advantage of the Thrusting Shields moveset, while taking very little damage. One thing I didn't mention about Thrusting Shields is that you can attack with them while blocking. And you can see how well this synergizes with our setup. You can continue attacking while blocking incoming hits, and also healing in the process. My favorite way to use this is to use it against an enemy's long combo. And this basically turns that combo against them, because you keep attacking during it without losing much health at all. For what talismans to use, I use the two-handed sword talisman for a 15% damage buff to all of our shield attacks. The rotten winged sword insignia, which increases damage with consecutive attacks. I'm also using the blade of mercy to get 20% more damage after a repost. I considered using the spear talisman, but it turns out that piercing damage only applies to physical damage, and much of our damage is magic damage, so I don't bother. Finally, we have the Viridian Amber Medallion plus 3, because this is a very stamina hungry build. I also like to use a Bickel Turtleneck before a fight to get higher stamina regeneration. I'm also using the Magic Shard and Crack tier for more magic damage. At our intelligence level, the best staff to use is the Academic Glendstone staff, and for what spells to use, I like using Magic Blend Blade before a fight to get some good damage and stance damage in. I also use Night Comet to deal damage from a distance and maintain stance damage. Finally, the weapon art I use is Glowing Blade Phalanx. I like this a lot because we're basically using the shield to cast it, which fits the theme that we are going for. It also deals more poise damage than the spell version, and we even get a follow-up melee attack to close in the distance. And so this Ashophore is a very good match for this build in my opinion. For the look, I use the Carian Knight Helmet, Rellana's Armor, Rellana's Greaves, and the Carian Knight Gauntlets. This is my favorite thrusting shield build. We make full use of the weapon, and we have tons of versatility to play how we want. Next, we have my Vagabond build. The Vagabond forgoes any use of magic. No Golden Vow, no Flame Grant Me Strength, none of that. Instead, we use other things that we find on our journey to give us an advantage. Elden Ring's crafting system is not super deep or anything, but it's good at giving us offensive options and buffs to make our characters stronger. There's a huge scarcity problem with it, but that's why this build rewards exploration. It's simple, you do more exploration, you get more items to make your character stronger. But you don't have to farm anything. The Vagabond is more than strong enough to take on the whole game without ever touching crafting. But the use of it gives us that edge that makes this build that much more powerful. Our weapon of choice is the Heavy Broadsword. This is the highest damaging straight sword in the game. It scales best with strength, and two-handing it gives us a huge damage bonus. A bonus that is boosted even further with the use of the two-handed talisman. Our Ash 4th choice is Square Off, which might look basic, but it is one of the best Ashes of 4 in the game. You hold your sword in a stance, where you can either follow up with a fast upward slash that does good damage and can also break enemy guards, or a running heavy thrust attack that deals massive damage. Both of these attacks deal some very good stance damage and cost very little FP. We are boosting that damage even further with the use of Rellana's cameo, which gives us a huge 45% damage buff when we hold the stance for more than 1 second. For what other talismans to use, you could take this build in any direction you want, but for me personally, I love deflecting with the deflecting heart here, so I'm using the curved sword talisman for more guard counter damage, and the Blade of Mercy for a 20% damage buff when we riposte an enemy. The fact that we have our broadsword be infused with heavy means that we can use grease buffs to buff our weapon with various elements to take advantage of enemy weaknesses. For example, Gaius here is very weak to holy damage, and we use it to bring him down faster. Drawstring greases are types of grease that can be used very quickly while walking or running, and they deal much more damage than the regular greases, but they last much less. It used to be that these were very hard to craft, because they needed string, and string was super rare in the lands between for some reason. You can now just buy it in the DLC though. Now let's go over food. Most foods that you eat, with some exceptions, give you a type of buff called the body buff, and you can only have one active body buff at a time. There are 3 items from this category that I like to use. First is boiled crab, which gives you a 20% physical damage negation. You don't even need to craft this one, you just buy it. Exalted flesh will give you a 20% physical damage buff, and most damage we deal is physical, so this is good for us. Blood boil aromatic gives you an even bigger 30% physical damage buff, and even a 20% increase in stamina, but it makes you take 25% more damage, so be careful when using it. Now let's go over the exceptions I mentioned. Pickled turtleneck and well-pickled turtleneck boost your stamina recovery. These will not stack with each other, but they will stack with other body buffs. These items increase rune gain and item discovery, and they stack with everything. There is no reason not to use them. Another type of buff is aura buffs, and again, these will stack with other types of buffs, but not with each other. You only really have one option worth considering, and that is to slap Golden Vow on a dagger, and use it for more damage and defense. You could use the item version, but honestly, I just wouldn't bother. Now one thing I like to do, mostly just for roleplay, is to switch to a dagger I keep in my offhand for reposts. I don't know why, but it just feels so badass to me. This is the look I went for, using the Messmer Soldier Armor, the Godric Soldier Gauntlets, and the Vulgar Militia Greaves. This build is a bit more simplistic, but I do enjoy it a lot. Here is my Desert Sorceress build, inspired by the ones from Dark Souls 2. This build combines the use of fire incantations and the Magma Blade, which was indirectly buffed by the introduction of the Talisman of the Dread. What makes this build truly special is the very effective use of Malenia's Great Rune. As you might know, Malenia's Great Rune gives you time to recover lost health by attacking an enemy right after getting hit. And the skill of the Magma Blade scatters magma all around you while you perform it. This magma will hit your enemies many times and will linger on the ground, dealing even more damage over time if they walk on it. What you might not have known is that the magma does work with the Great Rune, resulting in you recovering high amounts of health very quickly. Even the magma lingering on the ground will recover your health too. Look at this clip of me performing the skill, getting my attack interrupted by the boss, but still recovering my health anyway because of the lingering magma on the ground. Pretty cool, I think. This basically means that if you're aggressive and know which windows to attack in, you basically never have to use your health flasks. This gives the spell tons of survivability, despite it being technically on the glass cannon side of things. For what spells to use, we of course use Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength for more damage and defense, but for what offensive spells to use, it's up to you really. Any fire spell will synergize greatly with this setup, so feel free to use any combination of Giant Flame spells, the Black Flame spells, or even the Messmer fire spells, and maybe use their respective seals for more damage with them. I personally like to use the Giant Flame spells because they fit the spell the most in terms of looks. Another spell I like to use is Catch Flame, which isn't a Giant's Flame spell, so it isn't boosted by the seal, but it is an amazing melee spell with tons of DPS, and will usually outperform your regular sword swings. For talismans, we of course use the Shard of Alexander for more weapon art damage, the Talisman of the Dread, which increases magma damage by 15%, the Fire Scorpion Charm, which raises all fire damage dealt by 12%. It does however result in us taking 10% more damage, so if you don't want that, feel free to use Flux Canvas Talisman for an 8% increase to incantation damage, Millicent's Prosthesis for more damage with consecutive attacks, or the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for a 20% physical damage negation. Our fourth talisman of choice is the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, which increases damage dealt with consecutive attacks. For the physic, I use the Flame Shrouded Cracktear for more fire damage, and the Thorny Cracktear for more damage with consecutive attacks. And for the look, I'm using the altered version of the Rotten Grave Creeper Cloak, the Rotten Duelist Greaves, the Traveler's Manchette, and the Crimson Hood. This setup makes us light roll, which makes us a very agile character. It also makes us look very, hot. Next is my Dragon Fest build. We all know the trope of skilled martial artists being dragons, and this is a version of that in Elden Ring. The idea of this build is to combine two items. First is the dragon form from the DLC, and the second item is the Blue Dancer Charm. The Blue Dancer Charm talisman gives us more physical damage the less equipment load that we have, and the dragon form weighs nothing, but gives us a nice 10% damage negation to all damage types. So we get all the benefits of being naked, like more damage and being able to light roll, while lessening the downsides of us taking more damage. Our weapon of choice is the Heavy Infused Dryleaf Arts, which is one of the two martial art weapons introduced in the DLC. They both have 1 unit of weight, which means that they're the lightest weapons in the game that can deal physical damage, making them a natural fit for this build. You could use Dane's Footwork instead, which is much better at guard counters, but I'm not really focusing on that here, and which one is better for our use case is really down to preference, and so I chose this one. What Ashafori choose is again mostly down to preference, but I went with Dryleaf Whirlwind before, so I'm going with Ban Blast this time, which is a chargeable attack that gives us a huge amount of poise while charging it, and deals very heavy damage. It also sends enemies flying. The Rock Heart, which is the item that we use to transform into a dragon, can be used afterwards to give you a 20% damage buff to all dragon incantations for 60 seconds. And so it makes sense to cast dragon incantations with this build. Our seal of choice is the Clawmark Seal, which is a seal that scales with strength, which is a good match for a strength build such as this one. For what spells to use, spells like Dragon Maw, Dragon Claw, and the Rat Dragon spells all deal physical damage, and so they benefit from the Blue Dancer Charm. I also recommend using Dragon Ice, because it can inflict Frostbite, which deals a chunk of damage and makes enemies take 20% more damage. The reason we use this instead of Borealis' Mist is that they both deal the same amount of build-up, meaning they both proc Frostbite at the same speed as each other. The only difference between them is damage, and the fact that Borealis' Mist is slower and more expensive, and they both deal magic damage, which means that they don't benefit from the Blue Dancer Charm, which is important for other spells because we don't have much incantation scaling, and the buff makes up for that, and so we use Dragon Ice just for its ability to proc Frostbite. By the way, both of the Rot spells deal the same amount of stats build-up too, which means I prefer Rotten Breath over the more expensive one, but they both deal physical damage, so there is more of a case to using the more expensive one here, because it gets more damage and more range. For what talismans to use, I'm focusing on heavy attacks with this build, and so besides the Blue Dancer Charm, I'm using the Axe Talisman for more charged attack damage. Charged heavy attacks makes us stance break enemies very frequently, and so I use the Blade of Mercy for a 20% damage buff on a repost. And finally, I use the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia for more damage with consecutive attacks. For the physic, I like to use the Thorny Cracktear for more damage with consecutive attacks, and the Spiked Cracktear for more damage with charged heavy attacks. For the look, there's not much to say here, we're not really wearing any armor, we're just using the dragon form, but we're still gonna be seeing our character each time we die, and before reapplying the transformation. And so, I went for this look for my base character, based on the Draconian race from the character creator. Here are the sliders for it. Here we have my Fire Paladin build. This build is all about using a shield and a flail to stance break enemies very quickly and also make good use of the unique weapon art of the Serpent Flail. I always wanted to make a shield and a flail build, but it didn't make much sense because they were all bad. But the Serpent Flail from the DLC is actually pretty decent. The weapon art buffs our weapon with fire, making it deal more damage. But the real star of the show here is how it explodes when you do moves that slam the flail on the ground, dealing very heavy damage and consuming the buff in the process. Attacks that set off the explosions are running heavy attacks, jumping heavy attacks, rolling attacks, and charged heavy attacks. My favorite of these, and the one I use the most, is the running heavy attack. It's faster than the jumping heavy attack, and it deals about as much damage as the uncharged heavy attack. But unlike that one, there are items that actually buff the running heavy attack, so it's more useful overall. And we never use the charged heavy attack because of just how slow it is. Items that buff running heavy attacks would include Leda's Armor, which gives us 10% damage buff to running and dodging attacks, and the Lacerating Cross Tree Talisman, which also buffs our running attacks. Other talismans that I use would be the Shard of Alexander, which I didn't expect to buff this weapon at all, but it actually does. The Curved Sword Talisman for better guard counter damage, and of course the Blade of Mercy for a 20% damage buff after repost. Another item that I like to use is the Winged Serpent Helmet, which does buff all Fire Knight spells, including this one. My shield of choice is the Serpent Crest Shield, which is one of the coolest looking shields in the game. It has no skill on by default, which lets us use our weapon art freely without having to two-hand our weapon. I like to use the Messmer 5 spells with this build because they fit the theme pretty well. There are only 3 spells, but they're all amazing. Fire Serpent is a delayed projectile with good tracking, meaning that it will usually hit enemies that like to dodge spells. Messmer's Orb is this close-ranged AoE spell that sends enemies flying. It has you jump very high in the air, and so it can be used to dodge some low attacks before retaliating. And Rain of Fire is a ranged AoE option that deals decent damage over time. This used to be very bad, but it was buffed and it's actually decent now. And of course we have have Golden Vow and Flame grant me strength for more damage and defense. My seal of choice is the Fire Knight seal, and the scaling on it isn't actually too much lower than the Erdtree seal at our level, but it does buff our Fire Knight incantations, so using it is the obviously correct option here. For the physic, we have the Flame Shrouded Crack tier for more fire damage, and of course, it wouldn't be a Clanky Mocha video if you didn't yab about the Deflecting Heart tier at least 6 times. For the look, we have the Winged Serpent Helmet and Leadus Armor, and I pair them with the Fire Knight Gauntlets and the Messmer Shoulder Greaves. I honestly didn't expect a flail to make it to the series, but here we are. Beware though, although this build might look fun to play, and well, it is, the metallic balls on this flail are dummy thick. And the clanking noise they make with every swing and every fucking step will alert all the guards to your position. I'm just kidding, there is no such mechanic. But seriously, this is not for the faint of heart. And finally, we have my favorite build, which is the Carian Fencer. This build is all about dual-wielding fast thrusting weapons while incorporating parries and spells into our combos. We build up power through consecutive attacks and riposts, and then unleash that power through powerful spells. If you haven't yet gotten the memo, let me spell it out for you. Get it? Spell it out? I like deep and complex playstyles. I'm never content just relying on one weapon art or something like that. I'm not the most skilled player, not even close really, but I really appreciate just how high the ceiling is for skill expression in this game, and in that sense, it's very, very hard to top this build. Our weapons of choice are the Carian Sorcery Sword and the Mangosh Dagger, and we're actually able to dual wield these together like if they were both thrusting swords. The Carian Sorcery Sword is a thrusting sword, capable of casting spells with its heavy attack, and the possibilities when using this are just insane. You have access to a huge catalog of sorceries that you can incorporate into your combos. You could use melee attacks as combo starters or combo finishers, you could use projectile attacks to deal damage from a distance, maintain stance damage, or clear multiple enemies at once. Or you could even use some of the most powerful show-stopping spells, with some caveats for these ones. The Carian Sorcery Sword is obviously not the best catalyst for casting spells, but the versatility it offers by being its own melee weapon can't be understated. Our other weapon, the Mangosh, is a dagger that can be dual wielded with thrusting swords. We're using it as a parry tool. The main game had something similar going on with the Wakizachi, which was a dagger that could be dual wielded with full-sized katanas. It had the same function of acting as a parrying tool, while giving you access to the bar stancing moveset of the katanas. But the obvious problem with it was the fact that it would always have less range and damage than a regular katana. The Mangosh, though, does not have that problem. And that's because the bar stancing moveset for thrusting swords completely prioritizes the right-handed weapon for some reason. It's almost like it was designed with this weapon in mind, which is weird because this is a DLC weapon. This of course sucks for anyone that actually wants to use 2 thrusting swords, but it's perfect for us. We get access to this very quick moveset without any drawbacks. Now here's a fun story. The way I came up with this build is that while checking the wiki for this weapon, I found quite a few comments saying that this has as many parrying frames as the buckler, or even more in one instance. I was dumbfounded. Thinking that this has a parrying window as small as the other dagger was why I never used it to begin with. But now with the knowledge that this weapon has as many parrying frames as one of the best parrying tools in the game, made it so that I just couldn't resist using it. And so I tried it. And they were right. Although I had never used parries too much, parrying with this felt very intuitive and very rewarding. It felt like this entire new world of possibilities was now open to me. Parrying enemies and bosses became second nature to me. Well, of course, it turned out that they were wrong. When testing it, just to make sure, it turned out that I was right all along. This has the same parrying frames as any other dagger, but these stupid comments gaslit me into getting good with parrying. And I loved it. And you should try it too. For talismans, we use both consecutive attack talismans to boost our damage. And the best thing about these is that although most spells can't proc the effect from them, they are boosted by them. And so we can build up damage buffs using our melee attacks and use them to get more damage on our next spell. I also used the Graven Mass Talisman for more sorcery damage, and the Blade of Mercy, which gives us a 20% damage bonus on a repost. For what spells to use, Carian Slicer is a very obvious option, and it will be your bread and butter. I like to use this as either a combo starter or a combo finisher. For example, if you're going for a running attack, casting this is much better than using your weapons for it, and you can continue with your combo afterwards. As a combo ender, I used after the first attack or the second one, and it is shorter than going for the next attack in the combo, so you get just a little bit more damage in before backing out. You could also use it to dish out tons of damage during a long opening. Did I mention that this is one of the only spells that proc the consecutive attack talismans? Because it is, and it's not the only one. Another spell that does that is the Gavelheima. This is a stronger but slower spell that you can use for bigger openings. Another spell that does that is Carian Fencer, which does some pretty good damage and stance damage from a distance. These spells can also be used to widen your melee moveset, but these are the ones I'm using. Other spells I like to use are the Magic Blade Blade and Great Blade Phalanx to get some good damage and stance damage at the beginning of the fight. For physic tiers, I like to use the Magic Shrouded Crack tier for more magic damage, and the Thorny Crack tier is an obvious second choice. But I've been experimenting a lot with the Cerulean Stabbing Crack tier, which restores 5 FP on every melee hit. We don't exactly have the biggest FP bar, and so this is actually very useful for us. It contributes to the gameplay loop of us maybe casting a few spells at the beginning of a fight, regaining FP and building on power by fighting in melee, and then casting spells again, without ever breaking our momentum by drinking a flask. I mean, look at this moment where I ran out of FP, do a melee combo to get more FP, and finished up the combo with a Carian Slicer. Pretty cool, I think. Did I mention that Carian Slicer can itself recover FP through this? And it costs 4 FP, meaning that it's not just self-sustaining, but it actually recovers you 1 FP per cast. Of course, there's a caveat, and it is that this physic doesn't last 3 minutes like the rest of them. It only lasts 45 seconds, but it's still a very great boost for us. Now some bosses can't be parried. Well, actually most of them can't be parried. And for that we switched the Cerulean Stabbing Crack tier for the Deflecting Heart tier, and two-hand our weapon. At first it may seem like there is no way to guard counter with the Carian Sorcery Sword, because pressing the heavy attack after a block will just end up casting a spell. What you may not have known is that you can still guard counter by pressing the heavy attack and the light attack buttons at the same time. Guard counters deals very high stance damage, and so you'll end up stance breaking enemies about as often as you would with parries. And so you'll still benefit from the Blade of Mercy talisman. When I do play this way, I switch the consecutive attack talismans for the two-handed sword talisman and the curved sword talisman, and you'll get much better performance that way. For the look, I have the altered version of the Carian Knight armor, the Carian Knight gauntlets, and Rellana's greaves. This is my favorite build so far, and it's not even close. Hey everyone, if you made it this far, thanks a lot for the view. This was a compilation of the second trio of videos in this series. The first one of these did very well, and I can't thank you enough for this. These compilations are pretty cool because they let me take a second look at these builds and incorporate some of your feedback. Huge thanks to my one member. Wait, bro actually joined the members? Dude, it was a joke, you weren't supposed to do that. Well, thank you. Join the members now so that it's not actually a joke anymore. As always, let me know what build was your favorite. Give me any feedback that you have. Like, comment and subscribe for the algorithm. And bye-bye!